It was past 11 on a Thursday night in November when my son-in-law appeared at my door holding my granddaughter. She was 18 months old and sound asleep against his shoulder, her fist curled around his collar. He hadn't shaved in days. His eyes had the red, hollow look of someone who had been driving in the dark for a long time and refusing to let himself blink. I said, "Where is Cora?" He said, "She's gone, my mother." And then he stopped. He couldn't finish it. I stepped aside and let him in. This is a story based on real events. Some details have been changed to protect the people involved. Hello, everyone. If you've found your way to this channel, pull up a chair. Put the kettle on. I want to tell you what happened to my family last November, because I think it might help you look at the people you love a little differently. Write in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one. My name is Mabel. I'm 63 years old. I was a nurse practitioner at Grey Bruce Health Services for 27 years before I retired, and I have lived in the same farmhouse outside of Owen Sound, Ontario, for most of my adult life. It's an old place on 40 acres, more land than one woman needs on her own. But it was my husband Leonard's family property, and after he died of a heart attack 8 years ago, I couldn't bring myself to sell it. I have a large garden that takes up most of my summers. I put up preserves in September. I drive into town once a week for groceries, and I have supper with my brother Cecil every second Sunday. People who meet me for the first time make certain assumptions. Gray-haired woman, quiet voice, sensible boots. They decide I am ordinary, harmless. I don't correct them. My grandmother on my father's side was Métis, from a family that had worked the land in northern Ontario for generations before anyone thought to ask their permission. And she had a saying I have carried for 40 years. The still water is the one you can't see the bottom of. I was not gentle that night. I was very still, which is a different thing entirely. My son-in-law sat at my kitchen table and told me what had happened, haltingly, in pieces, while I put the kettle on and settled my granddaughter onto the sofa under a blanket. He is 36 years old, works in commercial insurance in Barrie, and is, on his best days, a decent man. I have always believed that about him. The trouble is that decent had never quite been enough to put him between my daughter and his mother. Her name is Hester. Hester is from old money in Simcoe County. Her husband Edmund built a land holding company over the decades that absorbed several smaller operations. They have a home on the water in Collingwood and a condo somewhere warm for the winters. Hester volunteers on charity boards and speaks in a particular tone of voice, pleasant, precise. That makes you feel you've said something embarrassing without being able to identify exactly what it was. She had been applying that voice to my daughter for 5 years. My daughter Cora married my son-in-law when she was 29. She is a grade 4 teacher. She is warm and stubborn, and she has her father's laugh, which I miss every single day. She also has my tendency to extend people more goodwill than the evidence calls for. When Hester began working on her, Cora thought she was being too sensitive. Then she thought she was imagining things. By the time I understood what was actually happening, nearly 2 years had passed, without a real conversation between us. There was no single dramatic moment. I want you to understand that, because I think most people who hear stories like this expect there to have been one. There wasn't. It was Hester mentioning, casually, at a family gathering I was not invited to, that Cora's closeness to her mother was holding her back from fully belonging. It was comments at dinners about my background, my Métis heritage specifically, framed as concern, worded just vaguely enough to deny if challenged. It was phone calls that grew shorter and shorter until Cora stopped returning them. And I was left speaking to voicemail, keeping my voice too cheerful, too careful, because I knew every word I said was being filtered through whatever Hester had planted. A mixed-up bloodline, she had apparently said once, at a dinner, in front of my son-in-law, who had said nothing. My daughter had pulled away the way people do when someone has successfully convinced them that the pulling away was their own idea. I had kept calling anyway. And then, eventually, I stopped, knowing what to do about it. That was where things stood until my son-in-law came to my door. He told me that Cora had found something. She had been helping organize records from his late grandfather's estate. His grandfather had established a testamentary trust years ago, held for the benefit of the grandchildren. Cora had been given temporary access to the documents to help prepare for an upcoming trustee meeting. In those files, she had found a series of transfers that did not add up. Large sums, between $15,000 and $40,000 a year, moved in chunks over the course of years, going to a numbered company she could find no public record of. When she searched the Ontario Business Registry, the company was registered under Hester's maiden name, with Hester listed as the sole director. She had asked Hester about it directly, at the family home in Collingwood. Hester had told her she had misread the documents, that the arrangement was complex, and Cora wouldn't be equipped to understand it. And then she said, and my son-in-law repeated this to me carefully because he had heard every word from the room next door. She said, "You have no business going through this family's affairs. You never truly belonged here, and women from your mother's background certainly never will." Cora had walked out of the house. She had called a cab from the end of the driveway. She had taken the bus north to Owen Sound, 3 hours in the dark in November, and walked the last stretch in the cold to the Women's Crisis Center on 9th Street East. My son-in-law had come to me because he had nowhere else to go. He didn't know the full shape of what Hester had said. He only knew his wife was gone, and his mother had been in the room. I looked at him across my kitchen table and asked one question. "Did you know about the money?" "No," he said. "I have spent 30 years reading people in urgent situations." He was not lying. "Then stay here tonight with the baby," I said. "In the morning, we find Cora." I didn't sleep. I sat at that same kitchen table with a notepad and wrote down everything he had told me. The numbered company, the timing of the transfers, the trustee meeting date. At 2 in the morning, I called the crisis center. I told them I was a retired nurse practitioner, that my daughter had arrived sometime that evening following a family conflict, and that I needed to leave a message for her. I kept my voice level. I gave Cora's name. The woman who answered said she could not confirm or deny individual clients, but she could pass a message along if I wanted to leave one. "Tell her," I said, "that her daughter is asleep and safe at my house. Tell her I am not angry. Tell her I'm coming in the morning and that we are going to sort this out together." There was a brief pause before she said she'd pass it along. That pause told me everything I needed to know. Cora was there. I was at the center at 7:30. My daughter was sitting in a small room off the main hall with a cup of Tim Hortons, coffee between her hands. Someone on staff had brought her one. And she looked like a person who had been carrying something for so long that she had finally set it down and wasn't yet sure how to stand without the weight of it. We sat across from each other. I didn't reach for her right away. I let her start. She talked for a long time, about the years of small comments and how they had gradually accumulated into something she had accepted as her own perception of herself and her family. About the night she found the files. About the numbered company. She had photographed the relevant pages on her phone before the confrontation. Her phone was still at the family home, but she had uploaded everything to a cloud storage account the week before, when she had first started to understand what she was looking at. And then she told me the other thing. She set her coffee down and put her hand over her stomach. "I'm 8 weeks," she said quietly. I sat with that for a moment. Hester had driven a pregnant woman out into the November cold. She had done it with words about bloodlines and belonging. She had done it to protect money she had been stealing from her own grandchildren's trust for years. I thought about my grandmother, about what she had passed down through my father and into me, and, without knowing it, into my daughter sitting in that chair across from me. Then I reached across and took Cora's hands in mine. "You handed nothing over," I said. "She just tried to take it anyway. Now we take it back." I called Cecil from the car. My brother is 68 years old and spent 32 years with the OPP, the last 12 of them as a detective sergeant. He lives in a house he built himself on the edge of Collingwood. He is a man of very few words, a quality our family has always produced alongside its other traits. And when he answered, I could hear a weather report playing quietly in the background. I gave him the facts without interpretation or emotion, just the shape of what Cora had found, what Hester had said, and what we were dealing with. He said, "Send me the photos from the cloud account. I'll start with the registry records. Then, is she all right?" "She's all right. She needs to see a doctor. I have a friend who runs a family medicine clinic here. He's discreet. Bring her to me." A pause. "Don't contact Edmund Marsh yet, Mabel. Let me see what we're actually looking at first." That was Cecil's way of telling me he already knew where to begin. We drove to Collingwood that afternoon in 2 cars. Cora and I in mine, my son-in-law following with the baby. The Georgian Bay shoreline in late November is stripped bare and gray and cold, and the light comes sideways at that time of year in a way that doesn't flatter anything. Cora slept against the window most of the way, which was the best thing she could have done. Cecil's kitchen table was already covered in printout by the time we arrived. He shook my son-in-law's hand, studied him with the quiet attention of a man who spent decades assessing people under pressure, and said, "I need to know whether you were aware of any of this." My son-in-law said no. Cecil nodded once, then "Sit down. There's more than you've been told." What Cecil had assembled in less than a day was thorough. The numbered company receiving transfers from the trust had also been receiving money from a separate personal account belonging to Edmund Marsh. Not the trust funds, but Edmund's own money, which then moved to a second account held in Hester's maiden name at a credit union in Barrie. The trust money was not simply being mismanaged, it was being laundered. Over 11 years, the total diverted from the trust came to somewhere between $350,000 and $400,000. This was not a matter of misread documents or complicated tax arrangements. This was deliberate and sustained fraud against the trust beneficiaries, including the little girl sitting in a bouncy chair on Cecil's kitchen floor. There was one more thing. My son-in-law had an older brother who had divorced 8 years prior. His ex-wife, a woman named Paula, who had worked as a bookkeeper, had also noticed financial irregularities during their marriage. She had raised it with her then-husband. Within a month, Hester had made her life sufficiently difficult that Paula signed the divorce papers simply to make it stop. Cecil had found her in Kitchener. She had agreed to write down what she remembered. My son-in-law was very quiet when Cecil finished speaking. He sat at the table looking at his hands. "She did this to someone else," he said. "It wasn't a question." "It appears so," Cecil said. My son-in-law looked up. "I should have asked more questions, a long time ago." He wasn't making excuses. He was stating a fact about himself, plainly, the way you do when you've decided not to avoid it. I gave him credit for that. Across the table, my daughter reached over and set her hand on his. I watched it happen and felt something ease quietly inside my chest. We spent 2 days at Cecil's house preparing. He spoke with a contact at the CRAA, not to file anything yet, but to understand precisely what we were dealing with and what it would take to move on it. The picture was straightforward. Trust fraud on this scale, documented the way we had it documented, was the kind of matter the CRA's enforcement division takes seriously. We also consulted with a civil litigation lawyer in Owen Sound, who confirmed that the trust beneficiaries had strong grounds to recover all diverted funds, with interest. Then we arranged to meet Edmund Marsh. Cecil had sent him a brief handwritten note, nothing electronic, stating that his daughter-in-law had brought us information that materially affected the family's legal exposure, and that, We were offering him a brief conversation before taking the next step. He agreed within 4 hours. We met on a Saturday morning at a Tim Hortons near the edge of Collingwood, public enough that nothing foolish could happen, busy enough that no one would try. Edmund came alone. That surprised me more than I let on. The absence of a lawyer or company men told me how rattled he actually was beneath that composed exterior. He ordered a coffee at the counter, carried it to our table himself, and sat down without offering his hand to any of us. He looked at me, then at Cecil, then at my son-in-law. "I expect this is about Hester," he said. "Yes," I said. I laid the documentation on the table between us in a sequence: the registry records, the bank transfers, the timeline, Paula's written statement. I set each one down and gave him the time to read it. He went through everything carefully and in silence, and I watched him understand, page by page, the full extent of what had been happening inside his own household. When he finished, he set the last page down and folded his hands around his coffee cup. "What are you asking for?" he said. I had written this out 2 nights earlier at Cecil's kitchen table, and I read from my notes. "The trust will be audited by an independent trustee with no connection to the Marsh family. All diverted funds will be repaid in full, with interest, for the benefit of the grandchildren, including the child my daughter is currently expecting." I paused to let that register. His jaw tightened, briefly. "Hester will have no further role in the financial affairs of any family member. She will not contact my daughter again. If Cora and my son-in-law choose to remain married, that decision is entirely their own, made without interference. If they choose not to, the terms will be equitable." Edmund said, "And you won't go to the CRA?" "We won't go to the CRA this week," Cecil said. "You have 7 days to begin putting these arrangements in place. After that, we review the progress and decide what comes next." Edmund studied Cecil with the measuring expression of a man trying to categorize someone he can't read. Cecil looked back at him without changing his face at all. He has always been very good at that. Then I said something that was not part of the negotiation, but that I needed to say. "Your wife told my daughter that our family is a mixed-up bloodline. She has spent years telling my daughter that where she comes from is something to be ashamed of." I kept my voice even and level. "My grandmother was Métis. Her people were on this land long before most of the families in Simcoe County had a surname attached to their property. What she passed down to me, the patience, the steadiness, the ability to look at what is actually in front of you and deal with it plainly, is the reason I am sitting across from you right now with documentation instead of falling to pieces." I folded my hands on the table. "That is not a bloodline to be ashamed of. I want you to understand that clearly before we leave this table." Edmund Marsh was silent for a long moment. The noise of the Saturday morning crowd moved around us. Someone's order called out at the counter, chairs scraping, the ordinary business of an ordinary morning. He said quietly, "I understand, and then, I'm sorry." I don't know whether he meant it. I'm not certain it matters. What matters is what he did in the 7 days that followed. He arranged the independent audit through a firm in Toronto with no prior connection to his family's interests. The repayment to the trust was documented and confirmed within the week. Hester signed a legal agreement, prepared, I later learned, by a lawyer acting on Edmund's instructions rather than her own, removing her from any financial role in the family and any involvement in Cora and my son-in-law's lives. She was told what the alternative was in whatever conversations pass between 2 people at the end of 40 years of marriage. And she chose not to find out whether we were prepared to follow through. She moved to her sister's home in Halifax before Christmas. That is all I know about it. It is enough. My son-in-law and my daughter did not have an easy winter. I will not pretend otherwise, because that would not be true, and it would not be useful to anyone listening. He had things to account for, years of choosing not to ask the questions he should have asked. She had to decide what she still believed about the man she had married and what a marriage could look like after that kind of reckoning. These are slow repairs. They don't happen all at once. But by February, they were in counseling together, and by spring, my son-in-law had arranged a transfer to an office in Owen Sound so they could be near family. They bought a house in town, their own house. Nothing with anyone else's history attached to it. In May, my daughter gave birth to a boy. They named him Leonard, after my late husband. His middle name is Roche, my grandmother's family name, the name her people had carried before other people's record-keeping, adjusted it into something easier to manage. Leonard Roche. He arrived 7 pounds and 2 ounces and announced himself to the delivery room, with the confidence of someone who has somewhere to be and is not interested in waiting. He has his mother's stubbornness already. He has my grandmother's dark eyes. Cecil came for supper the Sunday after Leonard was born. We ate at my kitchen table the way we always do, and he held the baby for a long while without saying very much. Then he looked up and said, "Grandma, Rose would have had something to say about all of this." "She would have said we took too long," I told him. He laughed. He doesn't do it nearly enough. I sat across from my brother in my own kitchen and looked at my grandson and thought about what Hester had believed, that the thing she was using against us would weaken us. That words about bloodlines and belonging would make us go quietly and not come back. She had not understood what she was up against because she had never thought to find out where we actually came from. She had only seen what she assumed. What we come from does not apologize. It survives. It keeps records. It makes the phone calls at 2 in the morning and drives 3 hours in November and sits down at the table with everything laid out plainly and the patience to see it through. It names babies after the people who walked through harder things than this and still managed to hand something worth keeping to the next generation. A mixed-up bloodline. I think about that phrase sometimes, sitting on my porch in the long summer evenings with Leonard asleep against my shoulder. I think about my grandmother and what she carried, and my father and what he carried, and my daughter and what she is carrying forward now into this child's life. I think about all the hands that held someone like this, going back further than anyone in this county thought to look. It is not a bloodline to be ashamed of. It never was. It is the reason we are all still here. If this story touched something in your own experience, leave a comment below. I do read them all. And if someone in your life needed to hear this today, share it with them. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We are here every week. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.